The evolution of consciousness has to do with how our four bodies have interacted through the past. So Steiner says, if you go back to the time of Atlantis, okay, he says your etheric, okay, let's look, our etheric body right now is right around our physical body. It's right here, okay? And in that way, we have hardly any influences from the cosmos anymore that reach consciousness. They're all working out in our life forces. You know, hierarchical beings build our cells. They're intelligently doing that all the time. All this stuff is happening. We don't know it anymore. We say to people, where's God? Why isn't God helpful? How could there be a God? The world's so That's because, according to the evolution of consciousness, the hierarchies have been stepping away from us, epoch through epoch, and leaving us freer and freer and freer. But if you go back in time, they weren't. They were involved in our experience in such a way that we didn't have any freedom or sense of self at all, except for the highest leaders and the most advanced people. The rest of the people lived very much in a group soul, kind of hive-like experience, even though it was human still, so it was far more complex than a hive of bees or ants or something. And it was because our etheric bodies were huge. They were way, way out here. And in that sense, the influences of the spiritual beings reacted on our consciousness. When we would have sense perceptions, they had let's go back to Atlantic, they had hardly any definition at all. But the hierarchies were so involved in our having perceptions that they infused what we were doing with a wisdom and an understanding, like you see in bees and stuff, the incredible wisdom of a hive and stuff. They could still do amazingly complex things, build pyramids and all this kind of thing, even though the sense of self, Craig, was pretty much absent. Isn't that an interesting idea? So the sense of freedom, there wasn't any. So we try to plant our political institutions on the past and go, look at how these people were slaves and everything. It's an error in understanding because we don't know the modality of consciousness that they were living in.
Yes.
So this causes, to me, this was a big deal in the terms of studying history, that Steiner just, whoa, what? You mean consciousness hasn't been exactly the same throughout history? He goes, you wouldn't believe how different it was. So that there was a time when the elementals, we completely worked with the elementals. You looked at a certain plant and you knew that was going to affect a stomach ailment you had. It was an immediate knowing. You didn't have to work it out with tinctures and retorts and figure out if it worked. It was an immediate comprehension. And then, but the sense of self was hardly there at all. So you've got these two kind of pendulum swings. Amazing natural clairvoyance in the population, but with very little sense of self. Okay?
Yes.
Got the picture? Now evolution happens. One of the first people that said, no, we're not going to allow the influences. So what's happening in evolution is this etheric body is gradually getting closer and closer to the physical body and becoming kind of united with it. Okay? Mm-hmm. And as that's occurring, the influences, the clairvoyance that we had is diminishing. And in place of that, our sense perceptions are getting clearer and more precise in their outlines and in our relationships to things, but the knowledge we get is disappearing. Right? That instinctive clairvoyant knowledge that we get. And a lot of it got just transferred into tradition. Right? As it decayed away and disappeared, people would write it down or people would share it orally through old wives' tales or the shaman in the tribe or whatever it was, right? And so a lot of wisdom was still preserved, but it all became tradition. Nobody had direct existential experience of that knowing anymore.
Yes.
And Steiner talks about these epochs that we went through. So from 747 BC to 1413, we had a period called the intellectual soul consciousness. And now we're in what's called the consciousness soul consciousness, or he calls it the spirit. From 1413, we're in the middle of it right now until 3550 AD. We're doing something where we're totally, you might say, separate. I'm going to say it, but people will be upset, but we're separated from the spiritual world.
Yes.
And we're asked to build ourselves into spiritual beings.
Yes, of course.
Okay, God has said, and you can make a lot of mistakes, because you're reincarnating anyway. You really don't die. Sorry about that. I know you wish you would sometimes, but you just don't. You know?
Oh, yes.
So we're only just beginning that. Okay, but in the intellectual soul period from 747 to 1413, you have a time where in the perceptions, and I'm going to be generalizing too much, but let's speak specifically of Greece, that in the perceptions, they still had a sort of, in their thinking life, they sort of still had a remnant of clairvoyance, but it rode on this new unfolding logical kind of way that they thought. And I was always fascinated reading the Greeks, that I would read this incredibly complex thinking process, and you could tell they weren't even trying. It was the easiest thing in the world for them to do. It just flowed out of them. You and I, we'd have to sit down and think this through. Excuse me for a second, you know? And they're just like, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, that is so gorgeous. What's going on there? And Steiner talks about that the life of thought, they were just like on a wave on an ocean, you know? It was, and that was because of the nature of the etheric body's relationship to these other bodies at that time. Again, this whole process going on. So I just wanted to throw that out, you know, that this evolution of consciousness doesn't allow us to take our modality of consciousness and our framework of ideas and say, this is how somebody in 6000 BC lived. That's grotesquely in error from Steiner's spiritual research.
That makes sense.
Okay.
It absolutely does. Yes.
And here's another little tidbit. So when they would experience the life of thinking in, let's say, these ancient Egyptian times, they literally experienced the activity of spiritual beings in their consciousness. And that activity was so awesome. So it left them in such awe and bliss and ecstasy that they loved it. They loved being coerced, you might say, by the spiritual life of their thinking. It moved them. You know, in whatever the hive-like thing is, okay? So what happened in the evolution of consciousness now in our day, we don't have any of that. What we have to do is grab hold of our brain and experience that life of thought that's still out here, and we have to grab it through how it reflects in our brain. And when it reflects through our brain, all we end up with, instead of the living presence of spiritual beings, is the images of their activity. So our thoughts are actually the corpses of living thinking from the intuitive thinking as a spiritual path, right? He talks about living thinking in there. But this is what's so cool. Because those thoughts are now only images, they have no coercive power over us. We're now completely free. And I say that with a smile and with a frown.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Right? And
yes.
that's extraordinary. To me, that was an extraordinary idea when I realized, right, if we had the full presence of the spiritual world in our thought life, there would be no freedom. We would be just coerced by the magnificence of their presence in everything, right? And that's really how schizophrenics and some people with mental illnesses, I think you could say it might be happening. They may actually have that kind of a pathology in their etheric and astral bodies where these beings are there and they're just lost in a certain sad way, right? Okay. So that's just a rough picture. And he talks about the evolution of consciousness throughout all of his writings. It permeates it.